For more than 9 months, I've been using the Adam Audio T8Vs as my main studio monitors. I then got the Adam Audio T10S subwoofer about 4 weeks ago, so I have quite some experience with both of these speakers. And in this video, I want to share that experience with you. I'm going to show you everything you need to know about these speakers, from how they work to how you can set them up, and if I would ultimately recommend getting them. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into it. A big thank you goes to Adam Audio for hooking me up with a T10S subwoofer. This video wouldn't have been possible without that. That said, it's still a review, and a critical review, so I'm gonna name both the positive and the negative, that is to say, about their speakers and my experience with them. Okay, so let's take a look at the main speakers first. These are the Adam Audio T8Vs, the 8-inch variant of their entry-level T series. Now these speakers are a two-way system, so they have 2 amps for the individual drivers. They also feature Adam Audio's signature UR tweeters, which are these golden tweeters that are usually hard to find in this price bracket. They are both meant to make a bigger sweet spot, so the area where you can sit and actually have the most neutral sound, and also allow for less E-fatigue, so longer mixing sessions. On the back you have access to all of the switches and connections that the speakers have, so you get 2 individual switches for bass and treble control, so you can basically boost/decrease both the bass and the high frequencies of your sound by 2 dB each. Not the most finest way of doing room control, but it gets the job done. Underneath that you have access to the main volume control that's completely unrasterized. So as you can see, you can turn it around freely, which results in a kind of unsatisfying end result where you fiddle around with these knobs for ages trying to match the left and right speaker to exactly the same volume. I simply don't understand why Adam Audio hasn't taken the chance to add a rustler to this, at least at the 0 dB mark. Besides this, you can switch between the XLR and the RCA input. So XLR is what you would use in your usual music studio, and RCA is if you had any kind of hi-fi setup where you had an external amplifier already. Usually you just want to connect this with XLR. More on that in the setup section. Now the build quality of these speakers is pretty solid. They actually feel kind of lightweight though, at least compared to the actual size and the Yamaha HS7s that I had before. And this actually brings me to my next point. Why did I actually get these speakers? I didn't have any complaints with my Yamaha HS7s, and if I would have kept them, they would have probably lasted me another 5 to 10 years. I also know that this is not a comparison between the Yamahas and the Adam Audio speakers, but these are just the 2 speakers that I've used the longest, and they're also probably the most common in their price bracket. Generally speaking, I would say that the Yamahas are a little bit more comforting and a little less critical than the Adam Audios. The main reason I upgraded was because I wanted the 8-inch driver. Both systems sounds really similar in my opinion. Now for the 9 months I've been using the T8Vs as my main studio monitors, they have actually suited me pretty well. So they sound pretty neutral and balanced, and also quite critical, so if there's any issues with your mixes, you're gonna notice that. I also feel like the ribbon tweeters do improve the sound and the quality of the speaker. At first I thought it would be more of like a gimmick that kind of looks cool but doesn't do anything in practice, but in my experience they do reduce my ear fatigue, so I can listen to music for longer periods of time without, getting tired and my ears not being that good anymore. Nothing world changing, but definitely a good feature. Now there are 2, if you count the unrasterized level knob, 3 things that can bother you with the speaker. So first of all, they don't have that much juice, just they don't go as loud. They work perfectly fine in the studio setup. I have set them to 0 dB and they do me good. But if I would want to throw a party with these in a slightly bigger room, I wouldn't think I could do this. This also leads to the second issue, that is again an amp issue I think, and that's a really slight high noise that's coming from the speaker whenever there's no music playing. Nothing that would be a deal breaker, you can get used to it really quickly, but it's definitely there and it kind of bothers me from time to time. Overall I would say the T8Vs are super hard to beat in value in the budget studio monitor market. The issues I've noticed are more kind of small inconveniences rather than big issues, so I'm perfectly fine with that. Now if the T8Vs are such a great pair of speakers, why did I even want a subwoofer? Adam Audio claims a frequency range from 33 to 25,000 Hz on these speakers, and while that's a cool statement, in reality they physically can't go lower than 50 to 60 Hz, at least not in a good sounding way. And that's exactly where a subwoofer comes into play. When you're thinking about getting a subwoofer for your music studio, it's less about cranking up the bass and making it loud, but more about just bringing up these lower frequencies from like 20 to 80 Hz that you usually only can hear on headphones where you can't feel them physically, or on big live systems that you probably don't have at home. Now, I personally never had another subwoofer before, so I was curious on a few things. First of all, how big of a difference in bass does it actually make? So my Adam Audio T8Vs have big woofers and they already go pretty low, at least compared to our studio monitors. So how much extra bass will I actually be getting from adding a 10-inch subwoofer to my system? I also wanted to know if adding a subwoofer could actually improve the sound of my low mids and mids, which were still done by my main monitors. In theory, if you add a subwoofer to your mix, you take away all these low frequencies from the signal that's been played by your main speakers, so they have more room and more juice to reproduce the mid frequencies. And this can at least result in a better sounding system overall. Now, a lot of places also suggest that adding a subwoofer is a really dumb idea if your room is not treated well, because it brings out a bunch of low frequencies that are pretty hard to control in terms of room acoustics, and it can at least bring up a bunch of issues. So I was curious if my mostly untreated room could handle these frequencies and how good or bad it would actually sound like. We're gonna discuss all of these questions in the final section of this video. I just wanted to, bring them out before that, so you get an idea of what we're looking for in this video. Let's check out the subwoofer that I actually decided to go with. The Adam Audio T10S is the subwoofer that's supposed to be working best with the Adam Audio T series, and that's because it was designed to exactly work with the T5, T7 and T8Vs. Because of this, it really made sense for me to go with the speaker. It's also super big, so even though it's just a 10-inch sub driver, the actual cabinet is really huge, which, even though I was kind of expecting that already, still surprised me when I took it out of the box. On the front you have a green status LED that just lights up when the speaker is turned on and goes red when the speaker goes into sleep mode. On the back we have the similar controls as on the main monitors, with a few exemptions. We get the same unrasterized level control, which, to be fair, is not really an issue right here, as we don't need to level match the speaker exactly to another one. We also have 2 ins and 2 outs in both XLR and RCA connections. On the top you have a switch to inverse the polarity of the sub, called phase, and we also can decide the crossover frequency from 80 to 120 Hz to just bypassing it entirely. Now, last but not least, at the bottom you can plug in an external foot switch that you can use in order to bypass the sub entirely from the signal chain. Super great feature, more on that in a minute. Now, for the 4 weeks that I've had the speaker now, I must say it's been super great, and I feel like I couldn't really make music without it anymore. That said, the thing I don't really like with the speaker is the way they handle power management. So instead of having an on-off switch, you actually have the sleep mode that after 50 minutes of not detecting any audio is just automatically gonna switch off the subwoofer. And then if it detects some audio again, it's gonna switch the subwoofer back on. In theory this sounds great, because for a lot of people they probably set this up somewhere underneath the desk where they don't want to constantly, switched on and off between sessions. But at the same time, it takes a good few seconds until the subwoofer is turned on and you hear any sound at all. And also there's a slight click that you can hear through the main monitors, which kind of annoys me, just to be fair. Again, it's not a deal breaker, nothing that's super bad, but it's just something to be aware of. Alright, now in this section I'm going to talk you through the installation of the speakers and what you should watch out for. Hooking them up is super simple. You just take 2 XLR cables from your interface straight to your subwoofer, plug them into the left and right input, and then get 2 more XLR cables to connect the output of the subwoofer to your main monitors. Setting up the speakers inside your studio correctly is a lot harder than that though, and there's a bunch of science to it that you can read through. If you follow the following advice, you should be ready like 90% though. First, use some kind of decoupling from your floor or desk. This is usually achieved with monitor stands. I have these from ISO Acoustics. You can also use these ISO pads, but they're not 100% perfect. The ideal scenario is actually having your monitors behind your desk on these floor stems. Second, make sure that the tweeter of your speaker is directly on ear level, or if that's not possible, at least aim it at your ear by setting up the speaker a little bit on an angle so that the sound is actually going to be accurate. This is super important for your high frequencies. Third, you also want to make sure to set up your speakers in an equilateral triangle between both the speakers and your main listening position. This is going to ensure the best sweet spot, so where the music is going to sound the best, and also where the stereo image is the most accurate. Fourth, Your speakers also shouldn't be too close to a wall or to the corners of your room, or if it's not possible otherwise, at least have it the same distance on both the left and right side. Otherwise you're gonna get bass buildup. This can lead to an overly loud bass or a generally more muffled sound where the bass is not really that clear. So try to keep at least 20 to 30 centimeters of distance. In my studio that's not really possible, so I just have them pretty close to the wall. You can correct for it with the built-in room control, so just taking away a little bit of the bass. And to be honest, the Atom Audio T-Series is actually built in a way where the reflections of the wall is already kind of calculated in, so they're actually designed to work in small rooms where the speakers are relatively close to a wall. Fifth, last but not least, if you want to get a good sounding system, get speakers that actually fit your room. So if you are in a small room and you have super big speakers, the bass is just gonna be way too heavy and gonna cause a lot of problems. The speakers are also gonna be probably too loud to actually work in that room. And on the other hand, if you have a bigger room and you're running it on super small speakers, it's also not gonna sound great. They're just gonna be too thin and too quiet to rock with the room. Now with the subwoofer setup, it's all down to trial and error. So the first thing you want to set up is your crossover range. So that's where the subwoofer is gonna let go of the audio and give like all the upper frequencies to your main monitors. On the T10S you can decide between a 80 Hz and 120 Hz crossover range, or you can bypass it entirely. Now if you have speakers that are smaller than 5 inches, you should set it to 120 Hz, otherwise set it to 80 Hz, so that's exactly what I've done. From there, try moving around the sub in your studio until you find a spot where it sounds good. Can't really tell you what that sounds like, it really depends on your studio, but the bass should sound just as usual and a little bit lower. In case you're getting any issues with phase cancellation, so the bass is sounding too quiet or a little bit delayed, try flipping the phase switch until it sounds good again. And just experiment from there. Now, two locations that usually tend to work good is either in the corner of your room, because that can get rid of most reflections, or right underneath the left or right speaker. So that's also where I set up my subwoofer. It's just sitting underneath the desk, underneath my left studio monitor, and it works perfectly from there. Now, something I would also highly suggest you getting is a foot switch like this. So this is just a simple foot switch I can flick on and off. And with the T10S, it's gonna allow you to bypass the sub entirely. So there's no sub involved in the sound at all. It's also bypassing any of the frequency switches, and you're just getting the sound of your speakers, even though it's technically running through the subwoofer. I personally use this feature both in the evening hours where I don't really want to annoy my neighbors, but also during the day if I want to check how good the mix sounds on a stereo system. Just because not everybody has a subwoofer, so double checking is always a great idea. I paid about 10 bucks for this foot switch, so it's definitely worth getting. Now that was a lot of theory, and if you want you can go so much more deeper. But over the years I've came to realize one thing, and that's that the top sound quality, where I have really a linear signal that's sounding super accurate, is really only achieved by like top 0.1% of studios. That costs thousands to construct. So for your personal home studio, having a accurate room is something that's cool to have, but way less important than having a room that you enjoy working in and that actually inspires you to make music. And this goes especially for people like beat makers, songwriters, singers, all these kinds of people that don't need this 100% critical listening experience. Of course, if you're a mixing engineer, that might be a different story, but if you're a producer like me, it doesn't really matter all that much. Now for me, this means that I'm a music producer. I don't care about, the 100% critical mixing experience. I want to have fun, and I've decided to put in both giant 8-inch studio monitors as well as another subwoofer into a fairly small room, which from an audio perspective is a lot less than ideal. But at the end of the day, when I really want to do some critical mixing, I'm probably going to do that on headphones anyways, and it's just more cost efficient to not optimize this whole room for audio and get all of the audio treatment, but rather just have something that is really fun to play with when I'm actually making music and coming up with ideas. Also, over time you're gonna get used to your system and the way your speakers sound in your room. So, for example, I'm sitting in this room every single day listening to music, making music, and over time I develop a really good ear on what certain music is gonna sound like on my system, so that when I'm making music, I can basically achieve the same sound, even though this room is far from being linear response. So basically what I'm trying to say is, don't get too caught up in all the details and optimizing your room. Just sit down and make music, and if you really want to get that 100% clear mix, man, send it over to mixing engineer and he's gonna do it better than you anyways, probably at least. Alright, I think it's time to answer the main question of this video. Is the Atom T10S a good addition to the T8Vs, even though they're so huge? In my opinion, absolutely yes. It adds so much more music that I literally don't really enjoy listening to it without it now, because I just feel like there's a part of the music missing, like that whole sub frequency. And it's such a big difference between just, you know, hearing these low frequencies if you have headphones on and actually feeling them like in your whole body. It makes a super big difference. Now let's get back to the 3 questions that I had before getting the subwoofer. So, did it improve the bass of my T8Vs? By a ton actually. So it's not like it's just boosting up the bass and making it super loud so it annoys the neighbors, but it's actually just extending the reach of my speakers to, you know, actually display these sub frequencies below like 50 Hz. Super great addition in that way. Now, did it improve the sound of my main speakers at all, like the mid-range? With this one, I'm not 100% sure. Like, I've listened to a bunch of music, my own music, other people's music, great mixing references, and I've always did an A-B where I had the foot pedal right there and I switched the subwoofer on and off all the time basically. And you know, I just try to distinguish if the mids actually sound more clear. And I would say, yes, probably. It sounds like the stereo image is, you know, just going up a little bit. Like, the mids are getting a little bit more clear, especially with really good mixed orchestral and cinematic music. But how big of a difference actually comes from the mids sounding better and just, you know, the lows being a whole lot fuller, I'm not 100% sure. I would say it improved the mids, but that could just be my brain making things up. Now, how bad does the sub actually sound in my completely untreated room? So, I don't really have a reference to how it would sound in a good treated room, but I can already tell it's kind of an issue right here. So, for example, when I was making some beats, I had sections where I added bass notes that I thought were in key, but once I pitched them up or disabled the subwoofer, they were clearly out of key. So just because the whole bass sound was so muffled in here, it sounded like they were correct. So that is kind of an issue. The T10Vs are also not known for having the most clean or dry bass sound, so I think my room really amplifies that effect by, you know, not having any bass traps. And I might make a test in the future where I just get a bunch of treatment for this room and I test it again and see how much of a difference it actually makes. Alright, now to bring all of this really to a conclusion, I really like my Atom Audio T8Vs. I think they're really hard to beat in terms of value, and even though there are certain things I don't really like and that could have been done differently easily, for example the rasterized level controls, I still think they're a good pair of speakers that is well worth its money. Now, the T10S was a really good addition to the setup as well. I wasn't really sure about that before, because I heard a lot of people say, like, if you have 8-inch monitors you might not even need a sub and stuff like that, but it actually adds so much to the music that I couldn't even have thought of. So there are some problems with it, you know, my room is not ideal, maybe the speakers are also a little bit too big for this room. But at the end of the day, it's well worth that. As said, I'm a producer, I make beats that I want to actually feel, and it's more about the fun than the 100% accurate mixing process, so for me, it was definitely a win. Now, if you have any questions about both of the speakers, the combination, my thoughts, anything, just leave a comment and I'm happy to help you out. And with that being said, catch you in the next one. Bye.